how did we get here? How did we get here to this dystopian place? It's a question that I often ask myself, and I bet you often ask yourself too, right? Anybody kind of sane and civilized and thoughtful is asking themselves this question these days. So I want to take a second and just share some of my thoughts with you guys on dystopias, right? And this kind of stuff normally I'd put into one of my impenetrable essays, and I'm not torturing you with them so much these days. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. So let's talk a little bit about dystopias. So we're in a seriously dystopian place. All right. First of all, I want you to understand that, and I say that as an intellectual, a scholar, a thinker, an economist, right? Blah blah, whatever. It's a seriously dystopian place that we're at. It's not a joke. So when I think about dystopias, I think in terms of multiple dimensions of dystopias. Okay. And before I get there, let's just contrast dystopia for a second. Dystopia is a modern term, a very modern term, right? Back to the age of, I don't know, not so long ago, right? Feudalism. No such thing as a dystopia. People didn't use the word dystopia. Dystopia, obviously, is a counterpoint, right, to the notion of a utopia, right? It's a famous, book written, Age of Enlightenment, Age of Revolutions kind of era, positing, right? It's a famous book. It's a notorious book in some senses, because the worst thing we can accuse each other these days is of being utopian. I don't know if that's a good thing or a fair thing, right? Because when the idea came out of a utopia, which literally means good place, good future, right? It was revolutionary, because in those days, there was no such thing really as progress, right? The expanse of human history was just an endless series of slavery, serfdom, empire, peasantry, war, being ruled over by lords and nobles who, had the divine right of kings that was transmitted through their bloodline, through the generations. And you can see very clearly in that, sort of where the idea of fascism comes from too. This thread of genetic destiny sort of links them, okay? Fascism, too, is about a divine right, maybe not given by God, but given by a certain moral order of the cosmos, in which the strong, the merciless, the ruthless, the cunning, the violent, the brutal, the greedy rule over the weak, where the civilized and humane and decent ones, okay? So this idea of dystopia is a modern one, okay? And it's set in counterpoint to an almost unconscious belief that we have now that we are making progress towards a better place, towards a utopia. And I don't mean that in the modern sense of this cheap insult that New York Times columnists throw at people like us to say, oh, you're being utopian. No, I don't mean it in that sense, that we're making progress towards a good place, a good future. And good in a deep sense, in a profound sense, almost in the classical sense of Greek virtue, right? So utopia and dystopia are set in counterpoint to each other. It's very important to understand, all right? Because, and I really want to reinforce that point, that most of history, there's no such thing as dystopia because there's no such thing as utopia. There was just stagnation. Where you were born, peasant, slave, untouchable, king, noble, that's where you stayed forever. There was no sense that this destiny of humankind could ever be altered, okay, until the Age of Revolutions happened. And the Age of Revolutions happened fundamentally because of thoughts like utopia, because of thoughts like natural human rights, because of, big thoughts that were dangerous and heretical at the time, and still are today, right? Utopia is just as dangerous today as it was back then. Back then, people said, hey, you can't even think about a better future. And when people call us utopian, that's what they're saying too, all right? So I don't like that as an insult. Now, dystopias, modern thing. When I think about dystopias, I think in terms of multiple dimensions, okay? And one, the first one, very simple, is let's say a financial economic dystopia, all right? It's a ruling cabal at the top, and they take all the gains, and everybody else is sort of immiserated in classical European terms. It's a formal technical term. It means you don't get what you deserve. You're, in servitude in many ways. You're being exploited, all right? Another dimension we can think of is a technological dystopia, right? And this is sort of the vision that figures like William Gibson painted so vividly in the cyberpunk novels, right? So a world where technology, or a place where technology is used as a tool of repression and control. You're always being surveilled and tracked and spied on. Technology is not something that is a lever that lifts you up anymore. Technology has become a thing that enables systems of exploitation, and it enables a sense of stagnation and fixedness in society, right? Just like in all of history, there was no progress, right? There's no idea of progress. Serfdom forever. Another dimension, we can think about social dystopia, all right? And social dystopia is sort of caste society, all right? Untouchables, people who are shunned, who are exiled. Any deviation from ironclad social norms is punished heavily, right? And all of this is an obeisance to a kind of cult-like ruling figure. So cults are many examples of social dystopias, right? It's kind of adoring worship of a heroic leader, a mythology of salvation. Any infraction is punished. Everybody's cut off and isolated from their family or even themselves, right? And we can even think of a final dimension, which I think is a very important one to talk about, which is a human dystopia. And this is the dystopia of the mind, the dystopia of the spirit, okay? And this is where we come to accept our role in the production of a dystopia. Because dystopia is a thing that has to be produced and reproduced every day, every month, every hour, with every interaction, through every generation, all right? And a dystopia of the mind is sort of where our spirits and our souls and our intellects have broken. And we become weak morally. We become weak spiritually. We become weak intellectually. And we think to ourselves, well, the only role that I can play in my life is to exploit someone before I get exploited, is to repress someone before I get repressed, to feed on someone who is even weaker than me, okay? Now, I'm not saying that just for the sake of idle theorizing, all right? I really want you to observe some of these dimensions at work in the world around us. And of course, the obvious place to begin is America, right? Obviously, we can also talk about, I don't know, if you want to talk about other countries, we can, right? But we're speaking English. And the obvious place to begin is America. And what's interesting, fascinating about America is that it's become, all of these dimensions of dystopia are visible in America now, right? It's a financial, economic dystopia. It's 70% of people financially distressed. Everybody's sort of incredible pain because of this affordability crisis. Nobody knows how the average person has $1,000 saved for retirement, I think, right? This mind-blowing statistic I often use with you guys and talk about in talks and whatnot. Americans are more afraid of dying than Americans are more afraid of running out of money than they are of dying. It's real stuff of financial economic dystopia. But that doesn't even come close to capturing the extent of what's happened in America, right? There's also the technological dystopia end of things, right? So Americans glued to their screens. And these very kind of systems that patrol and spy on them and control them and addict them to these dopamine hits. And I think that's a big reason. I think the whole world, not just me, right? The whole world thinks that's a big reason why America is sort of so apathetic. It's hard to even use the right word. The famous example I use with my European friends is, hey man, you can't get across Paris on a weekend because the teachers are on strike or something, right? Or like the farmers are on strike because somebody said, a loaf of bread is going to cost 2 cents more or whatever, right? So America, right? The possibility of change seems to have been forestalled. It's one aspect of a technological or techno-social dystopia. You can also see clearly social dystopia in America, right? It's the rise of kind of caste society. You have the rich who became super rich, who became ultra rich, right? Seeing the world's first trillionaire is probably going to emerge in America. Kids living in poverty, average person struggling to make ends meet. So caste society has really emerged now, where kind of the layer that you're born in is the place you stay. And Americans are almost on the verge of neo-serfdom, right? They live in debt their whole lives. They don't really own much, right? So this way of life is sort of an illusion, okay? We can also, I think of America as this human dystopia, right? This dystopia inside. When the world looks at Americans, they see something going really wrong, guys, right? And if you're American and you've lived outside America, I think you have sort of this social, spiritual, moral epiphany, right? That people aren't like this in the rest of the world. They're not so indifferent. They're not so cruel. They're not so narcissistic. They're not so self-absorbed. They're not so ignorant. And that's not an insult, right? It's just an observation. And it's sort of really, it's sort of, unfortunately, it's true, right? I spent most of my life living in Canada and Europe, and it's 100% true. And the weird thing about America is, I'm not saying that Americans are bad, but I am saying that they don't understand, right, how much different and how some more warm and human life is in other places. And that's true of even the guys that in America that think they're sort of, right, incredibly nice and kind and whatnot. In the rest of the world, like, it's off the charts, right? And so in America, I think there's an inner dystopia going on too, right? Isn't people sort of grown intellectually, morally, spiritually weak? They sort of accepting that this is all that's possible, right? And they're happy to, maybe not happy, but accepting of playing their roles in the ongoing reproduction of a dystopia. Well, I just go to the office and do my job, right? Is denying people health care, or I don't know, right? Like choosing stocks that don't, right, make anybody any money. Whatever, it doesn't matter, right? So I see all these aspects of dystopia at work in America, and that's what the world sees, right? And one of the big questions before us now is what America has become going to be exported around the world, all right? Now, this is what Trump and the far right in America want to do. And what's happened and they were successful at it for the last 5-10 years, right? So this far right movement sprang up across the world, which were very dystopian, right? Go back to that historical counterpoint between utopia and dystopia. What the far right really believes is that a good place, a good future, is something undesirable. Our utopia is their dystopia, okay? And our utopia, and the reverse is also true. Their utopia is our dystopia. So right now in America, they're getting everything they want, right? It's going back to the dark ages. Vaccines, public health, basic oversight, basic functions of governance, Gestapos on the streets, concentration camps. That's their utopia. They got it all, right? It's our dystopia, okay? So America is very successful at exporting that model over the last 10 years. Now, what has happened differently now after Trump's reelection is that the rest of the world, especially Europe and Canada, are waking up and saying, we don't want that. We don't want to end up like that. Because now they're seeing the end game. They're seeing all those dimensions of dystopia converge in this implosive way in a collapsing America, okay? And they're beginning to say, we don't want to end up like that. That's not the model that we want to follow. We see where that ends up, and we deserve better. We want to pioneer a different way. And it's going to be our way. So with Trump's re-election, right, what happened in Canada was remarkable. If you haven't been following, Canada was poised to elect their own mini-Trump. And when Trump got elected, bang, one of the massive, biggest political turnarounds in history. Canadians sort of woke up in shock and came to their senses. In Europe, Trump's re-election drew a hard line under the far right, okay? Because even the far right in Europe doesn't want to be like Trump. And many of those figures are distancing themselves from Trump. So this isn't really political, right, in this kind of narrow sense, especially in American sense, right? Conservative, liberal, Democrats, Republicans, it's all BS, right? It's nonsense. It's macro political, or it's about political economy, or it's about sociopolitics, if you like. in the sense that the world is now beginning to recognize, I think, a little bit, that American dystopia is something that it doesn't want to be. Now, that's not universal, right? You can, by all means, argue that other societies are their own forms of dystopia, and you can apply my dimensions of dystopia to them if you want. I think the examples are pretty clear, right? We can all think of examples of other techno dystopias. We can all think of examples of other social dystopias, right? We don't need to talk much about those. So, this is the question for the world, right? Does America, as the hegemon, as the former hyperpower that is now imploding, right? Imploding on itself, and then the wreckage is kind of like shrapnel hitting the world, is that transformation going to produce a wave, a shock wave of dystopia spreading around the world, right? And for that to happen, we need to see American tech, American finance, American culture, American social contracts spreading around the world. The good news for now, I think, is that many parts of the world have woken up and come to their senses. So Europe now, Canada now, are firmly pursuing what they call, right, various forms of sovereignty: financial sovereignty, digital sovereignty, blah, 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 political sovereignty, rejecting America's dystopia. Now, that's not to say that America isn't going to take a lot down with it, okay? But it is to say that certain parts of the world are understanding the stakes here, okay? And it's not a coincidence, because when we think about this strain of the evolution of the thinking behind utopias, behind Enlightenment level thinking, and we can criticize the Enlightenment all we want, right? I'm happy to do it with you. If you want to criticize the Enlightenment stance on race or gender, what have you, I'm there with you. But that's not the point, right? For now, okay? If we think about this strain of thinking that was about human progress, and the idea that history could be more than just serfdom and feudalism and fascism, that line began in Europe, and it runs through Europe today. Okay? So that's a lot on utopia and dystopia. You know, and on a personal level, guys, you know, I mentioned that we were talking in the last video, right, about how I was one of the guys that helped create this field of economics that was about the way the economy should have been to avert all this mess, right? On a personal level, I think it's true for a lot of you guys, because I know a lot of you guys now, right? I know you're very accomplished in your field. I know you're very learned. I know you've been working in your own way to try and avert this mess. It's haunting and it's bleak for me to see this dystopia happen and this dystopian age emerge, okay? Because we shouldn't have been here. We know what the 1930s was. We know what serfdom and feudalism were. We know what fascism was. We know what authoritarianism was. We shouldn't be repeating these mistakes, right? And I feel a great sense of failure as an intellectual and as a thinker to watch a world repeating these mistakes. It means I didn't do my job well enough, right? And I wrestle with that. I'm open with you guys about that, right? I'm haunted by that. And so all of this stuff is connected and tied up, you know? The inner dystopia is something that it's our job, right? As thinkers, intellectuals, teachers, as leaders, as journalists, artists, poets, scholars, whatever, right? Our job is really to help people break those chains, okay? And in America, certainly, that job hasn't been done well at all, right? And that's something I want to talk more about, but that job hasn't been done well at all, right? Nobody is saying to Americans, really, because the American public intellectual life is garbage, right? It's pundits and surrogates, all this nonsense figures. Not saying to people, hey, man, there's a better way possible. We have to get to work on it. It's a lot of bitching, there's a lot of complaining, there's a lot of moaning, a lot of rage baiting. But this idea that there's this beautiful thread in history, which is the growth of the human soul, the human consciousness itself, arcing towards a better place, a better future. That thread, completely broken in America. That's the tragedy of it. Because that thread, that idea of all ideas, to me, is probably the greatest accomplishment in human history. Okay? That's a lot. I hope that was something for you to chew on. Comments, questions, stuff you want me to make videos about, below. Thank you. Talk to you soon.